What's that? Yeah, there is, but oh, yes. I think so. Okay, I'll see if I can get some today. Okay, we're going to get rolling here. God willing, the audio is working on the live stream. I don't know why, but when I went over, I always go over during the readings to make sure everything's coming through fine, and everybody had typed in that there was no audio. I had sound checked it this morning and everything, but tried replugging and to no avail. So, Elijah, do you mind sitting there to see if anybody writes in that we're inaudible again? Worst comes to worst, we have the video camera rolling. What's that? It is working? Okay, wonderful. Worst comes to worst, we always have the video rolling. It just is a much more labor-intensive process to get the video uploaded to the computer. It automatically divides them into 30-minute segments, so then you have to stitch those together into one file and then get that uploaded, which takes several hours as well. So it's not actually that hard to do. The problem is what you have to do is click and then wait for 45 minutes or an hour or however long it takes, and then you have to remember that that was happening. That's the hard step. Because then you have to click again and then wait 45 minutes or an hour and remember again. So anyway, if it doesn't stream to those who are joining us live online, my apologies, and we will get the recording up as soon as we can. Because I do have already, I've got 6 questions in front of me, and then the first thing I always do for these Ask Anything classes is open the floor if anybody's got anything else. And then what we'll do, I don't have a whiteboard. That's really changed my teaching style, not having a whiteboard. But normally what we do is we handle this very democratically and we vote what order we want to go in. So we'll give highest priority to those that people would like to hear most, and we'll work our way down through. And then if we get through all of them, great today. If we don't, then we can determine, whether, like I said, our last Ask Anything class, I think we cut it off after 6 weeks. Because we kept getting more questions in than we had gotten answered. And so, but anyway, we'll see what happens. So the questions that have come in from me, we have 3 different questions, or 3 different people came after the class 2 weeks ago about baptism. Wonder if we can explore a little bit more children who haven't been baptized. What's our view on that? What's their status before God, etc., when a child hasn't been baptized, particularly the situation of grandkids, great-grandkids, or people that where the parents haven't and perhaps even aren't intending to get them baptized. What does that mean? So that's one of the questions that came in, as I said, multiple times. Another question that came in, so in James last week, the epistle, we read that God doesn't tempt anyone. So why does the Lord's Prayer say, lead us not into temptation, if God doesn't tempt anyone anyway? Totally good question. So that's one that we can look at. And then it kind of came in as 2 separate questions, but they're definitely related. So one is the issue of cohabitation, and this has come up multiple times, and the elders and I have discussed it at length, particularly in situations where getting married, so if it's a later in life kind of situation, and getting married would have negative financial effects on income stream or that sort of thing. So that's a question that's come in, that's been discussed. And then related, but not the same thing, as I said, marriage and marriage licenses. Does a marriage have to have a marriage license in order to be a valid marriage in the eyes of God? This sort of thing. So these are questions that have also come in. And then additionally, a question about the Catholic belief in purgatory, and how would we potentially try to explain our take on that topic to someone who is coming from a Catholic perspective on the topic of purgatory. So I guess actually, since the baptism one were kind of related, we actually have, I think you could count them as 5 separate. So it would be the questions surrounding baptism, and particularly unbaptized children. The question regarding God not tempting anyone, so why do we then pray, lead us not into temptation? And then the question regarding cohabitation and marriage licenses. In a way, those are sort of connected as well. So I guess we have 4. Baptism, temptation, the cohabitation and marriage license topic, and then purgatory and a Lutheran take on that teaching. So those would be the 4 things. And what I usually do with this is say, we've got 4. Why don't you vote for, say, the 2 that maybe interest you most? That does not mean the others don't interest you. I'm sure you're deeply interested in the answers to all of these, but just as we decide what order to try to take things on with those who are present. And those of you who are online, feel free to type in as well, because Elijah's monitoring it. So that would be our topics: baptism, temptation, let's just say marriage issues, and purgatory. So pick two of those to put a hand up for. And if you're fine with any of them, then you can just not put a hand up. That's fine. But try to vote for no more than two here, because if you vote for all four, you haven't helped anything. All right, so baptism, the baptism questions that have come up. Who'd like to address that one today? All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, that's probably going to carry at least one of our topics. All right, temptation. Who would be like you to look? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. The cohabitation marriage license, that whole swirl. Ooh, that's a lot of enthusiastic hands. Put them back up again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. 11. Oh, sorry, Elijah. And then purgatory and a Lutheran explanation on that topic. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry. And then did we get any write-in votes? Okay, let me know if any come in. But it definitely shakes out that we've got the cohabitation marriage question has 11, and then the baptism question has 8. And then depending on what we hear from online, if anybody chooses to write in, which you don't have to, the question of temptation and the question of purgatory. Okay, so, can I recruit a helper? So everything the CDC says is that the virus does not transfer on surfaces. So we can hand out Bibles, you can hand sanitize after you get yours if you want to be safe. But I did write down for those questions that had come in earlier than today. Do you mind helping to distribute on this side, Elijah? Thank you. Oh. I don't have a mask, but I am vaccinated. At some point that should count for something, right? Yeah. Oh, are you? Very good. Let's see. Do you mind sharing? And then if I've got an extra, I'll bring it by. Okay. You've got some extras. Would you guys like one? Dave? I do have one more. Anybody who was going to be sharing prefer to have your own? Okay. Your buds. All right. You can huddle together. Okay. Guess who didn't have one? That was me. That was me. Yeah, I've got 3 more sitting in the sacristy there. Can you grab one for yourself and for Mom? All right. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to take volunteers here. And I want to take these on in somewhat of an orderly fashion. So first, we're going to take on the cohabitation question. That is inevitably going to touch on the marriage license question. So there's going to be some overlap here, but I do have different scriptures prepped for each. So I need someone, this is going to be an easy one to find, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Someone willing to stick a hand up? Bev's got that one. We're then going to look at Matthew 19, verse 5. Gary's got that one. 1 Corinthians 6, 15. All right, Christine, thank you very much. And then Ephesians 5, 3. Rachel's got that one. Excellent. So that's Genesis 2:24, Matthew 19:5, 1 Corinthians 6:15, Ephesians 5:3. We may spread out for some context when we get to those passages, but that's where we're headed. And then why don't we, because I think the 2 questions are inevitably going to bleed right one into another, Matthew 22:15-22. Elijah's got that. Romans 13, 1 through 5. John's got that one. All right, very good. Don't worry, there will be more verses if you didn't get a chance to look one up. So I'll just read through all those one more time. Genesis 2:24, Matthew 19:5, 1 Corinthians 6:15, Ephesians 5:3. These are the verses we're going to look at primarily as we consider this topic of cohabitation. And then the other 2, Matthew 22:15-22, and Romans 13, 1-5, are going to pertain more when we start to get into the marriages and marriage licenses topic specifically. As I said, obviously the 2 are intertwined. So if I can kind of summarize, because this has come up a number of times over the last couple of years. As I said, the elders and I had multiple meetings where we've talked about these issues and how do we try to address them case by case, but then as a church as well. And so let me kind of lay out for you a few different situations where the question could come up, and none of these is an actual situation, except those are generic enough to sort of cover a lot of situations. As I said, one would be a situation, older couple, but marriage would either end pension benefits or threaten Social Security benefits, something along those lines. And so there's a desire to live in a committed relationship with one another, but not certainty whether that becomes financially feasible. Normally, our system is designed, joint filing and all that sort of thing is designed to actually incentivize marriage as a relationship, but as we have aged past life expectancy and what some of the rules expected, new situations have arisen, excuse me, that have actually then created disincentives to marriage. So whereas before there were financial incentives to marry, now in this situation of a later in life marriage, particularly if there's already a previous spouse who has passed away, there's actually some very powerful, sometimes disincentives to marriage. So that's come up a number of times in a number of different contexts. And then, as I said, the related question that we're going to slide into is then, well, what about being married in the eyes of God, but just not filing with the state? What about something along those lines? And what would our take be on that? And so we're going to cover that. I can say from the beginning, the answers may not entirely be satisfactory, just because I think these are tricky questions for starters. And they challenge us. They challenge us to think through our own assumptions, our own worldviews. It's a very Lenten topic in that regard. They can chip away at areas that we'd rather feel more comfortable. And so please believe me that it's never my intent to offend. I'll do the very best I can to try to faithfully convey what I believe Scripture teaches. That's why we're going to go straight to Scriptures. You're not going to get just 20 minutes of what your pastor thinks. We're going to go to the Scriptures and then discuss. So that is the prelude or preface. Genesis 2:24. Who looked that one up for us? All right, go ahead. Jim's got that. Genesis 2:24.
Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.
Okay, very good. So this is the encapsulation at the very beginning. Obviously, we're on page 2 of the Bible. A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. This is God establishing the marital pattern. It's not one of our questions for today, but it's very clearly a male and a female that are designed to be counterparts with one another. I know that's increasingly countercultural to teach, but it has not changed in 6,000 years of recorded Scripture, nor has our teaching on that topic changed. We can teach with compassion. We can minister with compassion to those who have temptations in other directions, but that is what we view them as, temptations in directions other than what God has designed. God's design being male and female, and the two leave the father and mother and become one flesh together. This one flesh image, I think, is actually really, really helpful. And it's not just my thought, because then who looked up Matthew 19:5 for us? That was Gary. Can you read that for me?
It's actually there.
Yes, but who's speaking this time? Jesus. Jesus is quoting this. Here, the context, if we were to slow down and read the whole thing, is the question about marriage and divorce, which is really not our topic question for today. But Jesus quoting the exact same thing from Genesis, now here in the New Testament. The reason I do that is, remember, Scripture interprets Scripture. So if the idea ever entered that this was an Old Testament thing that didn't apply anymore once Christ had come, well, Christ uses it as the basis for his teaching as well. It applies just as much in the New Testament context. Elijah. One more vote on baptism. So it bumps from 8 to 9. Okay, very good. So it's still in second place. We'll get there, I think, today, I hope. All right, so Genesis 2:24. A man shall leave his father and mother, cling to his wife, and the two become one flesh. And this one flesh image. And we need to understand a little bit more, and if we can, through a biblical lens of what exactly is a one flesh union. So here's where things get a little bit interesting. 1 Corinthians chapter 6:15. Who had that? 1 Corinthians 6. Christine, go ahead.
Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, two will become one flesh.
Okay, so I'm glad you kept reading because we actually do need to hit through 16 to make full sense of that quote. Let me read it again into the microphone. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. Now, this is talking obviously about prostitution, which was not anything like our question. What it does do is highlight for us a biblical understanding of this one flesh union. And Paul, in his teaching, locates this one flesh union most directly. It's not to say there aren't other aspects of marriage that would be a one flesh union in a sense, but he locates the one flesh union in the fleshly act between husband and wife, and therefore in the sexual relationship between husband and wife. That's where this one flesh union is described as primarily consisting scripturally. The two shall become one flesh. Jesus renews this teaching as the basis for his teaching on divorce, which is a different topic, obviously. And then Paul renews it here in regards to sexual immorality, but points out that this is the one flesh union that takes place between a man and a wife. It's the sexual union that takes place. So I'm going to pause right there, because what we've just done in the shortest number of verses I could make it happen is built a pretty good biblical theology of what is marriage. Marriage is two separate creations of God, male and female, coming together to become one flesh, including, now that's obviously going to be emotional, and that's going to be, cognitive in terms of thoughts and reason and ideas, but it's also coming together physically in the sexual relationship as well, which God now views and describes as being, I don't think this is a metaphor, now a single flesh in his own eyes. And actually, I think, though there aren't any verses that draw this connection, we live in a sinful world, this is not always the result, etc., but what is the result of that one flesh union when every process works the way it's designed? It's actually a new life, which we know genetically is equally from both parts that were formerly separate, but now are inseparably united in one flesh. So I think it's just wonderful. It's somewhere between incredible science and incredible poetry. It's certainly incredible theology that the two become one flesh, and allowing for the fact that this does not always take place and we live in a fallen creation now. But that process then can produce a new one flesh, completely unique to the world, with no other genetic fingerprint or actual fingerprint that's ever resembled it. And so this is our biblical understanding of marriage. And well, a lot of those clauses that I just said have been under assault lately. I think when it's presented like that, it really is a beautiful, beautiful pattern that God has created. And I think that we as a church, when we just get into debating about it, we lose the beauty. A debate about poetry is inevitably going to ruin the poetry. And I think there's a poetry to what God has created here. And I think that we as a church do well to uphold that as a beautiful pattern. Now, historically, the church has had some difficulty with that because the church's relationship with sexuality has been a fraught one, leading all the way up to the topic that we talked about a little bit last week and a little bit the week before, like the celibacy of priests. And why did that develop? Because the church developed a sort of love-hate relationship with human sexuality for a number of reasons. I think these verses do a nice job of building for us a good scriptural understanding of what is marriage in the eyes of God. Any questions or thoughts at this point pertaining to kind of that summary of God's design of marriage? Just because I don't want to fly past it. Okay. So then, the other passage that I was going to have us look up, but I didn't have to because Dave read it, all the way back in Exodus, certainly as one of the Ten Commandments, we also have the prohibition against adultery. There has been debate over the years what exactly would count as adultery. Some of you might be familiar with, it's a little bit older use of language, but people who would distinguish between adultery and fornication. Would call adultery sexual behavior between two people who are married but not to one another, whereas fornication would refer to sexual behavior just outside of any marital relationship, neither partner in that situation being married to anybody. There's not really that distinction in the biblical language. The word that's used for adultery just means, basically, as a thumbnail definition, sexual behavior with somebody who's not your spouse. That's all there is to that. Anything that would fit the description of sexual behavior with somebody who's not your spouse would be covered, I believe, in my work with the languages, both in the Hebrew and the Greek. It's pretty easy. You've got what God described and said is good and even blessed as the source of new life being born, and gave us the command to Adam and Eve to go make babies. That was their only command, be fruitful and multiply. That was the only thing they were supposed to do. There was something they were not supposed to do. They failed at that one. They did manage to keep the first half. They managed to make babies. And that God blessed with new life this relationship that he created and declared it to be very good. Within those bounds, God celebrates that relationship, even the sexuality of it. And that's something I think that the Catholic Church lost sight of over the years. However, outside of those bounds is everything that would be covered by the prohibition. That those sexual relationships are to be experienced only within a marital relationship, are to be celebrated only within a marital relationship. Which then brings with it a kind of an implication, not even implication, almost kind of a direct application. So if the question is, people living together as man and wife, including a sexual relationship and that sort of thing, but not being married, that's not what we believe God teaches or encourages or blesses. We believe that would be a sinful arrangement. Not the unforgivable sin that can be forgiven, and nobody can see into anybody else's heart exactly where that stands, although I don't think it's inappropriate for pastors to probe a little bit on that topic. What the exact relationship is, because for reasons I'm not entirely certain of from Scripture, but God has given to that sexual relationship something unique, different from having dinner with somebody, different from other relationships that we would have. This is actually a helpful starting point if you're trying to explain a Christian understanding of sexuality to someone who is skeptical about Christian teachings of sexuality. Is that we understand instinctively that we have different levels of relationship with different people, and that different behaviors are going to be appropriate based on the different levels of behavior or different levels of relationship. So I give the example when I teach in confirmation, so a lot of this might be familiar to you. I hope it is. If you're at the mall or some public place, Home Depot or wherever, fill in the blank, and you bump into somebody that you know, how do you respond to seeing them? If it's somebody in confirmation, I'll say, if it's somebody that you just kind of know from class, how would you respond to seeing them? You might, a little wave, right? Or nod of the head. You could be the sort of person who goes like this, or the sort of person who goes like this. I don't know what that says about your personality, but moving your head one direction or the other, you're probably going to do one or the other. I'd be curious to go, if we had time, I'd go around and find out who are the nodders and who are the chin lifters, but that's all right. It's a side topic. But if it's someone who's just kind of an acquaintance, you might say, hey, and if you're not entirely sure, you might even do that little awkward dance where you kind of look a little extra long to see if they're going to also show that they recognize you, before you get into the awkward situation of waving and they don't wave back. So you kind of try to play it cool, right? You remember what high school was like. So at any rate, if it's just an acquaintance, it's going to be something along those lines. What if you're at the mall and you didn't realize it, but your best friend is there and you see them across the hall? What are you going to do? Well, you're definitely going to go over and you're going to greet them. You're going to hang out. You're probably going to walk around the mall. What if you go to the mall and a beloved relative, you didn't know they were in town, maybe they came as a surprise or something, but you see grandma or grandpa or somebody you weren't expecting to see, we're probably going to run right up and give them a hug, right? Maybe even have some tears of joy. So just with that one little image, we can have kind of an entryway to recognizing different relationships have different expressions of that relationship, some of which are more appropriate. You would not respond to the classmate who you think you remember what their name is the way that you would to grandma. If you ran over and hugged the classmate and got tears in your eyes, that would go strangely. right? And so we inherently know we have different relationships with different people, and different behavior is appropriate to those different relationships. We as Christians understand that the behavior of sexuality is only appropriate within the relationship of marriage. Right? So that can be, now it doesn't sound like this medieval confining thing. No, we believe sexuality is good and something to be celebrated within proper bounds, I mean in privacy, but something to be upheld as being a good thing, something to be held as God's design within the proper relationship, and not something to be celebrated outside of that proper relationship. And so that kind of would take us to our first point on cohabitation, which would be the dividing point is going to be, is this a sexual relationship or not? If it is, then there'd be a marriage in God's eyes. There should be a pledge, man and wife together becoming one flesh should carry with it marriage. If it is not, if it's a roommate's kind of a circumstance, even if it's a roommates who care for one another and so forth, I think it's unfortunate. Our society has gotten to the point to believe that any two people or more at this point who are close with one another must also be sexually involved, right? And this is why nobody, present day interpreters, I think interprets Jonathan and David's relationship correctly, because they all interpret it as being homoerotic. Well, no, definitely does not have to be sexual for it to be close. And we could probably go around and every one of us could say relationships that we have with others whom we deeply value, who are very close, where sex is not part of it. Very definitely. I lived with a man for 4 years. It was college. He was my roommate. There was definitely nothing sexual about it. By the way, he's a microbiologist. And if you have any questions about the vaccine that have you uneasy, I'll give you his name. He's very good at explaining it. He's a professor of microbiology at Ball State University. So if that's an issue, totally unrelated to the topic, but if that's an issue for any of you, you're trying to figure out navigating this weird vaccine world, I can give you his name. He'd be happy to help you out. Anyway, so this cohabitation issue, we got no problem with people living together. We have a problem with people living together as man and wife. And that really does zero in primarily on the nature of the relationship from a sexuality standpoint. There's one other implication, though, before we get to the marriage and marriage licenses side of this question, that I think is worthwhile. Whoever was looking up Ephesians 5:3, I did not forget you. All right, Rachel, what does Ephesians 5:3 say?
But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints.
Okay, and this translation is a little bit less helpful, I think. It's accurate, but a little bit less helpful. You don't happen to still have your NIV on you, do you? Do you mind doing double duty, looking up the same verse in the NIV, which I think does have a more helpful translation? As I said, this is perfectly accurate, and I'll take a look at it. So sexual immorality, all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you. But what does it mean to have something be named among you? Does this mean that I just said the word sexual immorality. Should I not have done that? Well, clearly Paul wrote those words, so it can't mean that we don't talk about it. What does it mean to have something be named? Did you find it? Ephesians 5:3?
But among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or greed, because these are improper for God's holy people.
Even a hint of sexual immorality. This is the phrase that I think is more helpful. When it says it shouldn't be named among you, I don't think it means that we as a group together can't talk about what God has taught about sexual immorality. If that was the answer, then Paul broke his own rule a ton of times. Instead, what it is sexual immorality shouldn't be the sort of charge that could actually stand against you. That people couldn't make charges and say, look at how they don't follow their teaching in regards to sexual morality and God's design for sexuality. That there shouldn't even be a hint of it along those lines. This is where application gets very difficult, because cultures are different and have changed. At the time that Paul was writing, just to use it as a touch point, households would include all kinds of relations who weren't just husband and wife. Because if you think it through, a house is a permanent item. Therefore, the permanent items were always going to be inherited by whom? who had the right to inherit the permanent goods in that society? What's that? Oldest son. Yep, absolutely. So let's say, and this is not all that outlandish, let's say the father, he's had, let's say 3 sons, 3 daughters, all right? Because we'll go with that. 3 sons, 3 daughters, and he dies at, say, 50, which is also not outlandish for that time in life expectancy. So now the eldest son, who in reality is likely probably around 30 or so, age-wise, he is now the paterfamilias. He is now the house father, and he is the one of authority. But what about his other 2 brothers? Are they kicked out at this point? No, they still live there. The eldest may have gotten married. Maybe one of them has moved out. A successful apprenticeship has meant he's been able to build his own home and maybe start his own homestead, but maybe another one still lives there with his wife. And this would not be outlandish at all, would not be outlandish in a lot of global cultures, even to this day, that within the home could be multiple different generations, multiple different marital relationships, cohabiting without it ever seeming any way untoward or inappropriate. So this is where the challenge comes with a cohabitation arrangement. I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility at all for 2 Christians, even of the opposite gender, to cohabit and to do so celibately and to do so in a way that is not in any way sinful or dishonoring to God. The concern that I would still have, that I would want to address, is just how do you go about making sure that that's not misinterpreted in a society that so easily just endorses living together as man and wife without becoming man and wife. That then, if that's the arrangement, that the living experience that you believe God is leading you to, then I also believe, and I've said this to folks, comes somewhat of the responsibility to try to make sure that that's not going to be misinterpreted or misunderstood by other people. So let me pause there, because that's the extent of the passages that I was planning on us looking up. And we can discuss a little further, because I think there may be a couple other implications as well in the question that aren't specifically addressed by these scriptures. But let me pause there. Any questions or thoughts thus far? Yes, Brenda.
Question about, you mentioned culture.
Yep.
And our culture today is very open and permissive regarding sexual activity, and it's promoted.
Yep.
In movies and,
Yep.
and
we parade about it.
People say the arts and culture is
Yep.
considered artistic, but it's there. It's permeated our culture to a point where it's become so acceptable.
Right.
And that's a very disturbing thing to me.
Yep.
I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah. Well, and the phrase that maybe gets at it, she said the way our culture has just turned to celebrating everything sexual. And like I said, we have pride parades about this. The issue, we were talking about the whole inanity of Mr. Potato Head, right? You've seen the news, whether he's Mr. Potato Head and Mrs. Potato Head, or just the potato heads I had as a kid did not have those attachments. So the same way that there was a debate a few years ago about Bert and Ernie, and there was the desire to say Bert and Ernie are gay. Bert and Ernie don't exist from the waist down. They exist to here, and then it's an arm. So, I mean, the inanity here, and this is getting back to what I talked about, the whole idea that we can't even think of a close relationship without having to inject sex into it. I think there's 2 sides of this. There's the side of this that we can kind of shake our heads at, that, I think previous generations actually understood there was a closeness that didn't have to involve sexuality a lot better than our current generation recognizes it. But I think there's also a flip side, which is wired into us as humans, is recognizing that there is a closeness to a sexual relationship that does not exist in any other relationship that does not have that same. That doesn't mean that other relationships couldn't even feel closer in terms of support or intellectual agreement or that sort of thing, but there's something about that. If one partner in any kind of arrangement has to admit to cheating on another partner, they don't mean they went out to lunch, right? I mean, maybe that was part of it, and maybe that's the stage at which it gets stopped, but cheating is going to very clearly refer to sexual behavior. This is something, again, I think that's a touch point with culture. We still recognize that there's something uniquely special about the sexual relationship that's different from every other type of human interaction. And I think there's a vestige there of what God has created that we as Christians can still speak to. So I agree with you. This whole idea of sex, the phrase that I think brings it out the best, that drives me nuts, is people being what they call sex positive. You come across this phrase? Sex positive. The idea of we celebrate sexuality in all of its forms and all of its expressions. That's not sex positive. That's sex entirely non-discrimination. That's sex meaningless, not sex positive. The things that we value most, do we spray them around at every opportunity? The things that we value the most, we guard the most carefully, right? I mean, where are the things that are most valuable in your life? A lot of them are going to be in bank vaults, right? Or you maybe keep them in safes or that sort of thing. Now, obviously, we're Christians, we're going to say my family and things like that. But the things that are worth the most money, we don't just go toss them around, right? We guard those. I don't think sex positive means tossing it around every way you want at every opportunity. I think sex positive means holding this up as something unique and special and something that's not to be tossed around willy-nilly, but to be protected and to be nurtured in the place where it can be best developed and cared for. And that's God's design for marriage. So I think the one implication that Ephesians 5:3 brings to the fore is when there's an arrangement of cohabitation which is not living as man and wife, I think that there's then just the challenge of how do you try to avoid, in a society that so quickly assumes sexuality, so mindlessly assumes sexuality, how to kind of swim upstream in that kind of setting. And I am not one who believes that that is not possible to do. There are some pastors who would teach against cohabitation under any circumstances. I will say, obviously, there's a lot more temptation in that situation, and we have to be practical about temptation as well. But I don't think it's at all impossible for two people to be roommates or that sort of thing without it having to turn into a sexual relationship. And that's, I think, the topic for prayer. And we could get into as many different answers as there were applications. So I think that's where it's best to leave it where we've got it. I do think with that, well, actually, no. Let's go into the marriage and marriage licenses topic, which I think will also address the one other thing that remains the challenge from the original cohabitation question, which is these societal rules, and sometimes if it relates to Social Security, even legal situations, that create such a disincentive for marriage, because I think there may be a responsibility there for us as Christians as well. But before that, we're now introducing the state side of things, the kingdom of the left hand. This is what we were talking about last week as we finished up the Augsburg Confession, where God rules by law as opposed to where God rules by grace. And so let's take a look at Matthew 22. These are necessarily a little bit longer passages because this has to be a little bit more nuanced. So Matthew 22, 15 to 22. Was that you, Elijah? All right. And then who had Romans 13, 1 through 5? That was you, John. All right. Excellent. Elijah, Matthew 22, 15 to 22.
Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him, along with Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me a coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and walked away.
Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's. Context obviously is teaching about taxes, which is not our topic for today. But when it comes to marriage, thus far, as I said, I think we already built a very well encapsulated scriptural definition of what Scripture is. This is the first time we've talked about the state. Biblically, is the state an essential element of marriage? Just based on what we've already read from Scriptures. Has government come up at all in the Scriptures that we read yet? Marriage was instituted by whom? And it takes place before whom? God. And is acknowledged as such by the assembly of God's people before whom it takes place, and the proclamation of it and the celebration of it takes place in the eyes of all. Biblically, the state is not an essential element to a marriage. Who had the authority to marry Adam and Eve? That would be God alone. They were the only two humans. There was no government required. They did not have to go to the town clerk. There was none. There was no town. Biblically, it's one of the wonderful things about a Bible that covers so many years of history. You have many different cultures. Not all of them had the same rituals connected with what counts as a marriage. Marriage was something that was proclaimed publicly, that both parties agreed, I am being married. Marriage was clearly taught as being one man and one woman. Therefore, though we're not going down that road today, divorce questions are also legitimate questions about marriage, because otherwise you don't want to end up with 2 men and 2 women or that sort of thing when there have been previous marriages. Those are all legitimate topics. The only thing I'm drawing out is that, while I'm not arguing for anything revolutionary, we're going to look at Romans in just a second, the state is not an essential element of marriage from a biblical standpoint. Now, it may be here where we live, but not biblically. We would not have to say, if someone got married, I'm just going to pick a country just at random because I don't know, Ethiopia. If Ethiopia does not require a marriage license, I don't think that an Ethiopian couple moving to the United States would have to then go get a marriage license in order to be considered a valid marriage, or that their marriage that happened before they arrived would be considered invalid. They followed the customs of the place that they were in, and those customs are not necessarily unbiblical. That makes sense, the point that I'm making? That the Bible does not take a stance on the state's involvement in marriage. However, the Bible does take a stance on our involvement in the state. So, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 5.
Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. For you have no fear of the one who is in authority. Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience.
All right, very good. Thank you for reading that for us. Hopefully, if you're watching at home, you were able to follow along, look it up for yourselves, because I'm not going to reread the whole thing. But what it sets up here is God's ideal for the relationship between those of us who are already declared by God to be permanent citizens of the kingdom of the right hand, but who are still sojourning, are still visitors here in the kingdom of the left hand. And that is, God's ideal is that we are to be subject to the authority. We're taught scripturally, all authority is whose? All authority is rightly God's. Whenever any humans exercise authority, they're only doing so as God has equipped them, and in a sense, as a representation of him. That's why in the 10 Commandments, who's the only authority that it's commanded we have to honor? Honor your father and your mother. Right? I mean, after God, the only earthly authority, sorry, I should have been more specific, obviously. Have no other gods before me. When it gets to earthly relationships, honor your father and mother. Because in a sense, our parents are designated by God, empowered by God to serve in a sort of a God-like role. Not to be God, but to discipline, to protect, to care, to provide, all of those things we ultimately look to God for. On a human level, they talk about ultimate and mediate causes. God is the ultimate cause. Parents are the mediate cause. All right, so God delivers his care under most circumstances to children through parents, right? And then actually Luther makes the point, which I think is an interesting one at first blush and then becomes very helpful. Every other earthly authority essentially is filling this mother and father role in some way. So you think about, like, for instance, easy topic for authority, police officers. Well, in a sense, mothers and fathers can't walk around with people all the time, right? And so police officers help to serve and protect, right? As a lot of police departments have as their slogan. Ultimately, God has most directly given that to parents, but parents can't do it all the time. Same thing with things like teachers and that sort of thing. Obviously, as we become adults, our relationship to authority shifts in a way, but Luther uses that parent relationship as the type for all human relationships where we're instructed to show honor and respect. And I think that's helpful to talk about this ideal that Paul puts forward, and then also to talk about honor your father and mother and the way Luther applies that, as that authority is God's. He delegates it to humans. To that God-given delegated authority, we must give honor and respect. But this is a two-edged sword. Now, partly I pointed out when Paul wrote Romans 13, to the best of our knowledge, Nero was the emperor of Rome and was the ultimate authority and was a very ungodly person. That's why it was so valuable last week when we saw that we as Christians are really pretty much commanded to obey the law, except where the law would require us to disobey God's law. This is a pretty good rule of thumb. Unless the law was going to require us to disobey God's law, then it really needs to be our default that we're going to obey it. But there is, as you're aware, a little bit more complexity to it than that, a little bit more challenge, because as we're aware, there are human authorities who misuse that authority. And from a biblical standpoint, if all authority is truly God's, and this person over here is misusing authority, then that's no longer God's authority, is it? That's their own, and they don't have any on their own. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian, had to serve under Hitler, and one of the things that got him jailed was a sermon where he made the point that the Führer, which means leader, is an Obführer, which means a misleader. Not a good thing to say on public radio in Germany in the late 1930s. Helpful tip. But the point being that he said, this person, this chancellor, has no authority over me because all authority is God-given, and he's using this in ways that are directly contrary to God's. Therefore, he does not possess any authority. Now, why introduce this idea? For marriage and marriage licenses, as I said, biblically, the state is not described as being required to fill any particular role. A marriage is an act that really is done by God and is acknowledged by humans before God. Now, the state does have an interest in how marriages are conducted, etc. This is a good way to make sure, again, state filling in to help in a parental kind of a role. The state has more ways of making sure that this guy who's getting married here today doesn't have 5 other wives stashed all around the county or state or country or that sort of thing. That's a role that a state can do to help to support the God-given authority of marriage. Here's the challenge to me, and I will not be offended if you have a different view on this. I think we're outside of what Scripture teaches, and faithful people can hold different views. The state does not marry people. God marries people. The state can recognize that marriage or could refuse to recognize that marriage. And so for me, I have a little bit of a challenge living in the state of Connecticut because of the way the state laws are written in Connecticut. The state law is written that if I perform a marriage for a couple that does not have a marriage license, I can be held legally liable, up to but not exceeding a fine of $100. You'll pay it for me. Yeah, thank you. I don't know if that's just because this law went into effect in like the 1700s and they just haven't bothered to update it. I mean, it has gone through whatever it has to do from a statutory standpoint, but if you trace the history of marriage law in Connecticut, it was legally required all the way back into colonial times that the couple wanting to marry had to register with the state or with the town, but as a representative of government, had to register with the government. And here's my issue. The way that the statute is worded, it says that the state gives me the authority to marry them. No, I don't have the authority to marry them. God has the authority to marry them. Even when I perform the wedding in church, it's not me marrying them. It's God marrying them and me as the human vessel that God's using at that time. The same way that when communion is administered, that's not Rob's communion, that's God's communion. I'm the one that the congregation has called in proper order to be the one who administers that, but it's not mine. The same way that the marriage is not mine, those same questions that we asked about sacraments when administered by wicked people are still valid sacraments. A marriage, we don't consider it a sacrament, but a marriage is still valid even when I'm a wicked person who administers it. It's not that the state gives me the authority to marry people, because the state does not possess it. God possesses it. And I think theologically correct is that God has the authority to marry people, and the state has the authority to recognize that marriage. Now, am I about to storm Capitol Hill with my protest that we reword the law? No, but it is a point of difference between me and between the legal condition in Connecticut. So as a practical matter of application, what should we do? Well, again, I still feel like the default is, unless the law requires you to break God's law, our default needs to be following. However, this is where the other topic that I said could come up when the law creates all of these disincentives toward marriage. Now the question becomes something less than A equals B equals C. It becomes a little bit more difficult to navigate exactly where the faithful place is to land. Elijah.
It's even if you don't agree with it, it doesn't seem to require sin.
So that's why so his point was, even if you don't agree with it, it doesn't seem to require sin. I agree 100%, which is why I think the default should be for a couple getting married, go get the marriage license. You're going to have to pay whatever the fee is, and it's $50 or something like that. Go get the marriage license and get married. However, if the government also has other laws that create significant, essentially, penalty for doing so, that's where the navigation process becomes challenging. And that's the one part I really haven't dived into yet. So as a default, should Christians who are getting married get a marriage license? I think yes, because I don't think there's anything sinful about getting a marriage license. There's another wrinkle I'm going to get to, but Rachel.
Well, the state has fallen so far away from God.
That's the wrinkle.
The way they do everything anyway. So is it really, as a Christian, they're saying, like, you know, they're agreeing to all this stuff, but that's not God's will for marriage. So why are we bound to listen to that?
Let me, hey, Gary, you along with that? Similar?
Along the same lines, they might as well really muddy the waters up.
All right.
They go and get a license.
Right.
The marriage is performed.
Right.
Might be you, might be someone else.
Right. Right.
But it's never recorded.
Right.
In the eyes of God.
What happens?
Yeah.
Yep. All right. So
in the eyes of the state.
Yep. Let me come back, because that is the crux of it. Marriage in the eyes of God, marriage in the eyes of the state are the two always the same thing. To Rachel's point, as the state has defined marriage more and more differently than the church did. Go back to 1700s when the Connecticut law was first written. What the state considered a marriage would have been a man and a woman of legal age who are not currently married to anybody else. That's a legal marriage, right? Which is the same way that the church would have described it. Although, interestingly enough, not that I'm arguing for it, the church never said anything biblically about age, right? Now, that doesn't mean we're advocating for child marriages and that sort of thing, because, you know, it's a man and a woman, so it's clearly language of older. It doesn't say a boy and a girl, you know, that sort of thing. But interestingly enough, so the state's interest was just that the person's old enough to know what's happening and to basically assent to it. It has created some challenging laws about people with disabilities throughout history, and marriage rights and disabilities. That's a fraught topic as well. But the state does have some interest. In the 1700s, there would have been no difference between what the church would describe as being a valid marriage and what the state would describe as being a valid marriage. Is there a difference now between what we would describe as a valid marriage and what the state would describe as a valid marriage? Yes, a lot. So here's where the challenge comes. And I think we're sort of on the cusp of this and what it looks like. Elijah, by the time you're my age, I don't know. Does the church get out of the marriage license business entirely? As it is right now, I feel a little ill-used. I perform the marriage and the state gets $50. They're not deputizing me to do their work. Okay, I'll do it. It's fine. I like doing it. But As the divide grows between what biblical teaching is on marriage and what state teaching is on marriage, is the day coming when we will need to separate the two in some sort of formal fashion. I can't say it's not coming. I don't know. My predictions are not great, so I'm not going to go with that. But I do think the day could come where the state could say, if you issue any marriage licenses to any couples, then you must issue marriage licenses to any couples that want you to. That does not sound far-fetched or even like it might be that far away from where we are right now, especially with the Equality Act that's being debated and all of this sort of thing. The idea that the state could eventually say, if you are an issuer of marriage licenses, then you must issue marriage licenses to anyone that we validate to issue marriage licenses. Now we come to kind of the teeth of my objection. Who has the authority to marry? If you believe the state has the authority to marry two people, then that's a logical conclusion, that the state can tell who can and can't marry. If you believe God has the authority, then the state can only recognize that and has no right to redefine what God has defined. This really muddies the waters, doesn't it, for us in terms of what our position is. Now, Gary, to your point, what happens if someone gets married in the eyes of God? We do the ceremony, take the vows, all that sort of thing, but never files the marriage license. What's the status? Part of why I introduced the political side of it now is 50 years from now, that might be what all Christians need to do. There are countries, to my understanding, countries that have Sharia law will not allow Christians to marry. Does that mean that Christians in those countries should not marry? Or do they get married and not register with the state that they're married? I'm not saying we're headed towards Sharia law. I'm not an alarmist. It's just, it starts to introduce some interesting challenges. And they're not just interesting because they squeeze our lives. Like I said, the one other thing, what are we at for time? I knew this one might take a fair bit of time. So the other issue is when there are state policies, whether intentionally or not, that create these disincentives for marriage. For instance, something like losing Social Security benefits. On that, I would say, because I have done what research I could, survivor benefits do not end with remarriage. That one I found on the Social Security's website, but I don't know Social Security well enough to even know entirely what that means. Is there something besides survivor benefits that you receive through Social Security? I don't know. So here I would honestly have to say, talk to someone who's a lawyer in this state who's going to understand. But I do know there are pension plans that very specifically say now we're going to have to use gender language just because this dates back to when the pension was earned by the male. So on almost 100% of the situations, you're going to talk about a situation where a male earned a pension and then died, and the female now is the beneficiary and receives the pension payment. But the pension is written such that if she remarries, that pension ends. Now, the thinking behind this was not necessarily nefarious. The idea was if she remarries, now her husband can provide for her, and the company that was providing in place of the husband who's now deceased should not have to continue to basically pay her two salaries now. But the challenge has become when these policies were written, life expectancy was a lot shorter than it is now. Finish the lyric for me if you can from the Beatles song. Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? Are you kidding me? But when they wrote that, life expectancy in Great Britain was about 70-ish. There were only a few years left. We're living a lot longer now. It's created some problems that I don't think the law has caught up with, and some that I genuinely think are unjust. So we have to then defer to other principles. For instance, not bearing false witness. Pretending to not be married really probably isn't a route that we should go. But it's slightly complicated because if the policy, and here's where it varies by state. So I'm sorry, I told you this would be unsatisfactory, but at least we can talk about it. It's ask anything. It's not just ask the one pastor feels comfortable with the answers. All right, so it is ask anything. In some states, a cohabitation arrangement would end the pension the same way that a marriage would end the pension. And in some states, it does not. In the states where it does not, and I don't even know about Connecticut, I couldn't find it, I'm not a lawyer. In Connecticut, I don't know. But if there's a situation where the pension continues if you cohabit, but does not continue if you're married, that is an unjust law. Because in the eyes of God, that's the same thing. As we said, that's male and female living together as man and wife. There should be no situation that incentivizes people to live together as man and wife without marrying, but disincentivizes them from marrying. That, I believe, is an unjust law. And as such, it then enters the realm of, then what do we do? Would following that unjust law require us to sin? If so, then we must not follow it. If following it would require us discomfort, if following it would require uncertainty, this is where it becomes more uncomfortable to our own sense of peace and comfort. Because wherein does the challenge lie? What I would say, we only have 5 minutes left. There's no way to plumb this to its depth. This is why we ended up with 6 weeks of Ask Anything class last time, by the way. But does anybody feel like we're lingering too long on the topic? This is all the challenges that we're trying to work through. So, I mean, you're allowed to say if you did, but thank you for those of you who shook your head no. So now this is fraught, is it not? This is a difficult, because now we're dealing with the relationship between a Christian and the state. We're dealing with the relationship between marriage and the state, the different definition that marriage has, that the state has for marriage, than the church has for marriage, the authority relationship between the two. I think in this situation, this is actually something that the elders and I have spoken about and that we're going to continue to speak about. I think that the church has a little bit of a duty if there are policies, and here only, the government could only change the government's policies, although they could try to advocate. If there are policies that create disincentives for marriage for that situation, for older couples, widower kind of situation, the church should be at the forefront of advocating that those are unjust policies and should be overturned. I would not hold out a great deal of hope at it happening because the state and the church define marriage so differently. And there would be such, I believe, a population of citizens who have no problem with cohabiting, aren't interested in getting married, and therefore aren't really all that invested in wanting to change the rule. But I would think that it would be something to at least try to make the effort and be on record as saying, this is not right. We believe this to be wrong. Rachel.
This did happen in my family. And my dad married this wonderful Christian woman. And they investigated this and they went with their pastoral advice and they got married and did it in the eyes of God. And their answer to their marriage was, we are married in the sight of God and He is the ultimate authority. And they had a wonderful marriage because of that, because it was based on their Christian faith.
Yep.
And they so had their faith in God, and that's what this marriage was about. And it was a wonderful thing to see. Too bad family didn't all see it.
Yeah.
They
Different
did,
topic,
and that's
yeah.
what was.
So I actually did interact online with a lawyer. That's partly why I'm more familiar with Georgia's law than with Connecticut, because it was just someone I had interacted with on a Lutheran discussion board before. So I asked the question. He said, and this is just one guy on the internet, so I mean, take that for what it's worth. He said, if a couple were to say something to that effect, we know we're not married in the eyes of the state. We are married in the eyes of God. That's who we took our vows before. There's nothing dishonest in that statement.
No, and that's what they did.
And if the state has laws that do not treat, it was my Scrabble word for the day. Meretricious is the word for cohabiting. A meretricious relationship. meretricious, meretricious. A meretricious relationship is the legalese word for a cohabiting as man and wife, but not actually being married. In Georgia, as this lawyer was explaining, a meretricious relationship would end a pension payment the same way that a marriage would. If that's not the case in any other state, he said there would be no qualm in saying, I am married before the eyes of God and not married in the eyes of the state. The only dishonesty would come is if you pretended you were married in the eyes of the state and weren't, or pretended that you weren't married in the eyes of God when you were. So this is kind of, I don't know if you could say this is a preview of coming attractions or coming oppressions or whatever you want to use. This distinction between married by God and a marriage that is recognized by the state may be something we're going to have to become a lot more fluent in the coming decades. Maybe even shorter than that. I don't know. And that's part of why I think it serves us well to be as well informed as we can be, and to be a little bit, pageant. What I mean is, let's build a really good biblical foundation for what marriage is as taught and established by God, because then we're clearer on what the state's understanding of it is and where we do and do not agree, and the extent to which we can allow those things to overlap and the point at which we might necessarily need to acknowledge them as being separate. So, as I said, I suspect the answer is going to be unsatisfying because I'm not coming down really hard on any particular side here. What I hope that I can do is help to share all the things that factor into our thinking as Christians. From a biblical standpoint, our relationship. I hope the marriage stuff is very clear. That's why I paused right there. From there, the way that gets lived out, particularly when you introduce the state and the state's increasingly diverging definition of marriage, they're difficult waters to navigate. What I would say is these two things that I think we can say with confidence. One is the one that we said last week. Unless the law requires you to sin, following the law should be our default as Christians. I think that's where the conversation needs to start, as far as the specifics go. The other thing that I think we can say with absolute certainty is God's the ultimate authority. And if God is the ultimate authority, you may remember the sermon a little while ago where I pointed out that the root of that is author. He's the one who writes the story, right? Let's trust him to provide. If when we have our conversations about marital decisions, married in the eyes of the state, not married in the eyes of the state, married in the eyes of the pension, not married in the eyes of the pension, let's just be as careful as we can be that we're really trusting that God will provide, and not trusting that the pension will provide or the Social Security will provide or the anything else. Let's make sure that our trust is in God alone and see what decision would flow from there. And I hope I've made it plain that I'm not hidebound in believing it's always going to have to lead to XYZ decision. But those are the areas that I think Satan would love to use all this confusion, all this muddy water, and get us to rely on our own reason and our own experience instead of on Christ. Or get us to rely on our own ability to provide instead of on God who is a provider. If we know with a clear conscience before God, that's why Paul says the best thing about following the ruler is you got a clear conscience. If you can't follow the ruler with a clear conscience, then you're going to have to do a lot more praying, have a lot more thinking about it. And I think the one thing that I would say is we need to be humble enough to recognize that there may be other views on the topic than the ones that we've arrived at. As long as we're within those boundaries that I said we're pretty set on, other people might come to different conclusions on any specific question. And I think it's good to be loving and humble about those things. So we got through one question. So here's what happened last time. Last time, I got 3 more emails during the week of questions that occurred to people. That's fine. As I said multiple times last time, this is the value of an Ask Anything class, and I'm not expecting easy answers. I'm not expecting, is Jesus fully human and fully divine? I think you're probably clear on that, right? Although explaining it's awfully hard. I'm expecting tricky questions with tricky answers. And so if everybody's okay with it, are you okay with us bumping the unaddressed questions for now into next week? Everybody okay with that idea? And then if others occur to you, I'll start this week like last week, other than I'll let last week's order of business start. So we'll start next week with the question about baptism, particularly children who haven't been baptized, although we do currently have a tie then between temptation and purgatory as to which one we would do next. Any other questions occur to people, you can feel free to email them in or let me know. The least prepared answer will be if you tell me, if I say any other questions and I write it down, you'll get the least prepared answer. But that's fine. Don't let it stop you from asking the question. So why don't we close with a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for many things. We give you thanks as the creator of life. We give you thanks for the beautiful pattern you created for life, male and female, and them joining together into one flesh. But we know since the introduction of sin that Satan has attacked this one flesh union every which way he possibly can. We thank you for the beauty of your creation and grace, even in the midst of those attacks. We ask that you would enable us to withstand by your Spirit. We thank you for your word, which teaches us and is unchanging, even in the midst of our own shifting culture and our own shifting opinions and thoughts. Your word stands and will stand, and we thank you for that. Give us the humility to submit to it and the wisdom to understand it as you enable. On these difficult topics, give us your clarity. Make obvious to us the path that we should follow, and give us the courage of our convictions to see it through as your Holy Spirit enables. But also give us the humility of recognizing that others may have different views and different convictions, and trying to love and discuss these things in ways that can be mutually helpful. For all those who face these questions on a much more personal level, not an abstract, but affecting their daily reality, I pray for your spirit of wisdom that you promise to grant, and for a humility that would trust you wherever you lead, and the confidence in knowing that where you have led, you will provide. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Hopefully the audio stayed on the whole way. All right. Have a wonderful week, or half a week if I see you on Wednesday.